It is Wednesday, the 25th of November. It is 1 month, 30 days until Christmas. Welcome to the Shortlist. It's your host, Johnny Campbell. I'm co-founder of SocialTalent, and I'm here every week on your podcast or on your live YouTube and LinkedIn with another great guest this week on the Shortlist as we head into the run-in towards Christmas. What have we got? Maybe 3 or 4 shows left before Christmas. I'd love to know, by the way, those of you listening live, if you have put your Christmas decorations up. Are you there yet? Are you not? If you're in the US, tomorrow's Thanksgiving for you. So maybe you're going to listen to us as a podcast on your day off. That might be your cup of tea. Maybe it's not. Let's see. Don't forget the podcast. The Shortlist is a weekly show. It's a podcast available on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you find your podcast. It's also a live show on YouTube, on our SocialTalent channel, and on my LinkedIn profile on LinkedIn. And you can find all of our past episodes and our upcoming episode schedule at socialtalent.com/the shortlist. So, quick tip for you, by the way, with 30 days to go to Christmas. Go home, especially if you have young children, ask Alexa. I'm assuming you have an Alexa in your house. If Google Assist, I have no idea if Google works. Ask Alexa how many days until Christmas. She'll answer you and you'll get a little surprise at the end. Trust me, your kids are going to love it. Right, on with the show. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome this guest. He's a bundle of energy, but also just somebody who's a wealth of experience and knowledge and a great way of describing the world we work in if you're in talent acquisition or recruiting or hiring. I'm excited to get into our topic because, it's one that's dear to my heart, and that is the topic of making lots and lots of mistakes. And we're going to be talking about transforming talent acquisition. And as part of that, step one being the advice from our guest today is make lots of mistakes, and not in the Mark Zuckerberg break things and or fail fast and move on or whatever the heck. It's like just a reality of actually it's a good process to make mistakes. Trust me, in getting to where we are today, we've made lots of mistakes. I'm making more right now as you listen and watch. I guarantee you. I'd like to introduce, therefore, our guest today. And the guest is Paul Bowles. And Paul Bowles, my apology, Paul, I get your surname wrong before we even get into it. Paul is the global talent acquisition leader at Nokia. You may know Nokia from the phone that used to be in your pocket 20 years. Or if you're currently celebrating your 110th anniversary, maybe you know about their wood products from back in the day when you were a child. But Nokia is a very different business now. And Paul will no doubt tell us a little bit about what Nokia is today. And we're going to be talking about talent transformation, something that Paul is no stranger to in his career. And maybe we'll get an opportunity to hear Paul's stories of transformation in the very interesting roles he's held in Nokia, but also before that, and why you sometimes have to do things your own way to be successful. Paul, welcome to the show. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Remind our maybe older audience members about Nokia and who they are today, and update our brand new audience members who maybe don't know who Nokia is a business, and give them a bit of insight in terms of your world.
Brilliant. Thanks, Johnny. And again, really pleased to see you set me up nicely by making your first mistake. And just share a quick story. It's funny, often my name is Paul Bowles, but frequently people say Paul Bowles. And I find it's actually even worse for some reason with the medical profession. They always seem to call out my name as Paul Bowles in doctor surgeries and what have you. So I've learned to live with that over the years. Okay, so yeah, I'm in charge of talent acquisition with Nokia. I think it's kind of the best job in the company because it allows me to get involved in so many things. And I think anyone that works in talent acquisition, you kind of feel that, your job is quite important, and you're doing it because it allows you to get into lots of things. I'd say a little bit about Nokia, so I won't, bore you too much because we've got a really good website, so you can find out a lot about that. But historically, Nokia was known, I think in the late 90s and the early part of the millennium for phones, and the ubiquitous 3310, which I think a lot of people about my generation and maybe even slightly younger look at that as their go-to phone and their first phone. Johnny's mentioned Nokia had a proud history, 150 years old or so. We started off in timber, then we went through from there into rubber boots, and then from rubber boots we went into making TV surroundings. And then we moved into electronics, consumer electronics from TV surroundings and mobile phones. And around 2010, we sold the mobile phone division to Microsoft at the time, and really focused on networks, which is where we are now. So, now we think we're a world leader in 5G and the next generation of connectivity. And if you think, 4G was a big deal, just wait for 5G. And again, if you've heard something about 5G and that's a big deal, lower latency, faster bandwidth, just wait for 6G. It's going to be crazy, you know. Maybe when you think of a more original name than 6G, when you think about something different, I think, but that's where it is at the moment. So we've got about 90,000 people in Nokia. I'm in charge of recruitment. We recruit around 15,000 people a year, of which around 4,500 are professional hire, around 3,000 are campus, and around 7,000 are internal hire. So that's what we do. Prior to that, I'm really lucky. I spent 22 years. I know I don't look old enough, so you don't need to tell me that, but I spent 22 years working for a company called Thales. Again, a nice easy one to mispronounce, spelled Thales, Thales. And there I was really lucky. I had a load of cool jobs. I set up the corporate university in Australia, in Sydney, so I was lucky I lived near a beach there. I then set up the corporate university on the west coast of the US, and lived in California on the beach there as well. So that was a great thing. And then I had the opportunity, I got a phone call one day from a new head of HR in Thales. And he said, look, you know, I'd like you to lead a project looking at a new employer brand for the company. I did that. And then after I'd done that, he said, hey, how would you like to head up talent acquisition? And I said to him, I think you might have made a bit of a mistake, David, because if you look at my CV, I've recruited a lot of people as a manager, but I've never worked as a recruiter, or I've never worked in talent acquisition. And he said to me, okay, you know, he said, I know we've got some good people in talent acquisition, and the role's really about transformation and about going from where you are today into something new. So he took a chance on me, I guess, back in 2013. And I think then I found, you know, I'd really been passionate about learning and development, and I've been lucky. I've lived all around the world. I came back to the UK, so after living in the beach in Sydney and living in the beach in Southern California, I then ended up in the Wirral in the UK. So clearly I moved here for the weather. But, you know, again, I kind of found my home in talent acquisition because I'd loved the idea of talent management that I was able to do with the corporate university. I'd also loved the idea of selling things and about brand. And I loved the idea about, you know, developing people and bringing in something of value to the company. So I kind of found my natural home. It took me until I was 40 to figure out that that was my home. But, you know, this is the place I think I was always meant to be, working in talent acquisition. Johnny, does that kind of give you a bit of intro to me and who I am?
That's a great intro. That gives me all the information that I think we need to start with, but I'm going to come back and dig into loads of those things. We got a LinkedIn user saying triple loop learning is the key. I don't know what triple loop learning is. I just wikied it and it's interesting. You should explore that. I think it does fit in with our theme today. Jane King is saying, yes, she had one of those. I assume she's talking about the 6110 or the 6210 or the 6310. I think we all had them. I used to have a pile of Nokia bricks as they were back in the day, back in the late 90s, our first phones. Yeah, it brings me right back. Paul, I want to get topical with you. I want to just jump into some news articles that I think we've shared these in the last couple of days, and we're keen to get your thoughts, which means it's that time of the show where I ask Niall to roll our news credits. See, there's a whole meta thing that Niall is doing there where he's making mistakes because this show today is about making mistakes. So maybe I called you Bowles on purpose and Niall did the double jingle on purpose. Who knows what other mistake might go wrong today, Paul? All right, so let's get into our first article. This comes from Forbes. This is topical. It's about strategic thinking. And the authors here are talking about, well, they're kind of, I guess their thesis is that I didn't know this was a thing, right? Until I read this article, that apparently strategic thinking is becoming unfavorable, that people are so focused on short-term thinking since the pandemic kind of kicked off, that strategic thinking is taking a back seat. And the authors here are arguing that we need to restore this allegedly lost habit of strategic thinking. What's your experience on this?
It's a good point, Johnny. Good point. I think there is some truth in this. So I had a look at the article, and I think there is some truth that at the moment, with everything that's happening in the world around the pandemic, and I think particularly with the second wave as well, I think a lot of people are getting quite stuck in this idea about saying, okay, you know, fires are burning, there's so much going on, I need to focus on the here and now. And actually, there's so much uncertainty that actually, can we plan anything for the future? But I draw a little bit on some earlier experience. You know, during, you know, financial crises there was in 2008, 2009, and I remember some similar feelings there. You know, so really difficult to figure out what's going to happen in the world. And I think to a certain extent, we can always say there's always that temptation to focus on the here and now and not look further forward. And what's quite interesting in that article is about this idea about habits. So whether it takes 33 times to form a new habit, whether it takes 100 times to form a new habit. And I can sympathize a little bit because I used to smoke and I was really, really good at smoking. So I smoked for many, many years, and it was bloody hard to give up. And because it was a habit and all about ritual and routine. And I used to also get really, really good at giving up smoking as well. Really good. In fact, I gave it up about 9 times. I was so good at it. But then, I think eventually I did get into a new habit with that. And I think, bring that in some context here. I think it's about actually when there is great uncertainty, still clinging on some things that are certain. And, and this idea about, strategic thinking, there is still going to be a future. And in some ways, I might argue a little bit that the ability to think strategically now is even more important because, the temptation is to keep yourself in the here and now and keep the horizon out for 3 months. And I think sometimes even, I think we almost make a bit of a mystery what strategy and strategic thinking is. And actually, it's just a little bit about imagining what the future is going to be. So I think it's probably even more important now, I think, from my point of view, that we really begin to really imagine what the future could be. But I think to go with that is that idea that it's okay to unpick things. It's okay to pivot somewhat, and again, any good strategy does give you that ability to pivot because, macro events that happen in the world force you to do that and adapt your strategy. And if you don't adapt your strategy, then, you're not going to end up in a good place.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Like from my own personal experience and our business experience, as soon as we kind of locked into the hard things we had to do back in March at the beginning of the pandemic, we immediately moved into, well, what's the plan? Because I think in our personal lives and no matter where you are in the world, I think, there's so much uncertainty around you about the government, the levels of lockdown, all these different things. It's all short term. And you need a long term. Like you will go nuts if you don't have a long term to cling to. It's like if the business is saying to you, here's our 5-year plan, here's our 3-year plan, let's get involved in our 7-year planning process. That's a brilliant way of focusing on long term because it's really hard to focus on anything but short term in every other part of your life. It's a necessity, probably more than it's ever been, Paul, I'd say.
You got it, Johnny. And I mean, honestly, as well, I think, if I just go to a personal life, you always need something to look forward to. Otherwise, you get miserable. And I think that from a professional viewpoint, you always need to set out an idea of what the future could be. And again, I think then for the teams that, work for me and for, the people in our organization, Nokia, even during the whole pandemic, we've really focused on just talking about the future and things like, we had a new CEO in this time and he set out a new strategy. The temptation would be, hey, I just want to see what's going on, just keep things going, because to a certain extent, the business we're in is probably a little bit protected from the pandemic because everyone's wanting connectivity more than ever before. But it'd be very easy just to stay with that and say, okay, look, let's try and make rain while the sun shines. But our new CEO is, really talking about the future, talking about the strategy. And again, within TA, really have begun that process about imagining what the future can be with the teams and bringing them on that journey. So I would say, don't lose the habit of strategic thinking. There's so many things now, but that's going to be ongoing. There's so many external things, so many things that can stop you thinking about tomorrow, and you get caught up in the urgent and the urgent is quite exciting, and I've got to be honest, partly I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was in my notice period at my last company. And I remember thinking actually at the time, bloody hell, this is quite exciting, what's happening. Although there's so much going on, it's, lots of terrible things we're preparing for. There was some real adrenaline and excitement to kind of, put out those fires. But the danger is that can be quite addictive, because you can feel like a hero every day because you're doing something. But actually, don't, get addicted to that habit of the here and now. Always keep yourself looking forward to the future, I would say. Sometimes that can be difficult, but I think you just got to keep imagining things and just be ready to pivot.
Yeah, a few comments from our live audience. We've got Simon Maher saying design thinking is becoming more common too. I think you're right, Simon. A lot more people talking about that. I think they already had been, but back to the pandemic is an acceleration of everything, it seems. Jane King agreeing, she truly believes that this pandemic has taught businesses to be adaptable and think about how they can alter this to make them more future-proof. I think you're dead right. A great question from Josh. Taylor, I'm going to ask in a few minutes of you, Paul, once we get to it. So hold tight on that, Josh. One of the other parts of the article was saying how people are finding it so hard to do strategic thinking, brainstorming, planning. I hear this a lot, right? I'm sure you do as well. But it's a funny one. You kind of just have to. It's like you can sit there and go, it's harder. It is, right? It's harder to do it virtually than it is to do in a room, the way we would have done it in a brainstorming session or an offsite. I get that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Doesn't mean it doesn't have to be done. It still has to be done. So I'm not a person, I'm happy to talk about, oh, this is hard if it gets us to a new place and we come out with a new solution. But we're just going to sit there and moan that it's harder. Like, shut up, strategy is necessary. In fact, it's going to be healthy for you to rethink the strategy, to go back to I guarantee your strategy, even though it was written in January, it's out of date, right? It's this massive thing happened in the world. So maybe for Nokia, for example, it's meant probably an acceleration of things. It still means the strategy is out of date. Netflix, right? I was reading today, Netflix, they had like a boom of users, and then the latest quarter is the slowest quarterly growth in many years. But it's a different plan. They're still doing better than they planned to do, but like it's just going to look different. The growth is going to be at a different pace, faster than maybe slower than faster. Regardless of your business, I think strategy needs to be reviewed. And we're not going to go back to a desk anytime soon, right? Don't be waiting on drug trials and vaccines and that kind of nonsense, right? Just get on with it. Start working your strategy. Figure out a way. There's some good tips in that article. We'll share it out. I'm going to move on to our next news item, Paul, for us to have a look at. This is again from Entrepreneur Europe. And I don't know, did you see this show? It's talking about Michael Jordan and The Last Dance, which was on Netflix, if you remember, early pandemic days. Feels like years ago. I don't know if you watched this. Well, first of all, I'll ask you, did you watch The Last Dance? And then what are your thoughts about this this author's proposition that Michael Jordan is proving that passion must precede leadership? He's got some really good tips. I think they're good tips anyway, right? That's my opinion. Maybe you don't. First of all, so Last Dance, did you watch it? What do you think of it? And what do you think of this article?
Johnny, do you know what? I didn't watch it, but again,
cancel the broadcast. Get him off. We're done. He didn't watch The Last Dance. Shame on you.
Because I've missed out on Game of Thrones the first time round, so I kind of found that. So that was my go-to for the beginning of the pandemic. I'd say not Netflix. I forget what it was on. It was there many other good providers available, but not on Netflix. But I found Game of Thrones, which again, I've learned a lot from that as well. But it's on my list now. It's on my Netflix watch list after having read that article, I have to say.
It's a good one. You don't have to probably seen The Last Dance to get the point, right? Because it's there's sports analogies here, right? There was kind of four core points to be made in there. First, diving into those, and if I look at them, everyone on the team has to bounce back quickly. Everyone on the team has to improve the fundamentals and change their mindset. Everyone on the team has to get stronger, and everyone on the team has to believe. Those four things: bounce back quickly, improve the fundamentals, get stronger, and believe. Is that good advice? What do you think?
I think so. And I think the first one about resilience, that's pretty critical, because I think, it's just the acceptance, things do go wrong. And I think 2020 has taught us that a lot can go wrong, and it's always all in the recovery, so, and I think again about it, will take us to the thing about making mistakes. Mistakes are made, but it's all in that recovery. And I think reading the story in there, this idea about how the team, can, make mistakes, get things wrong, but actually how do you come back ready for your next game? Because it's very, very easy potentially to get on the downward spiral and fall into that whole kind of pit of self-recrimination. And what have I done? I've done this wrong. Then, that whole imposter syndrome on your shoulder can come and say, hey, of course you're going to do things wrong. You really don't know what you're doing, do you? So, again, it's just, you can get into that spiral. So I think that idea about being able to recover is so important, and so important now with the year we've had, and possibly with the year in fact, maybe the few years we've got ahead, is this idea about how everything that happens to you, how do you make yourself a bit resilient to that? And I think there's some things around self-awareness that are critical to make yourself resilient, but then also how to make teams and organizations resilient. So, and I think that's actually quite a critical thing. And I think there's a link between team resilience and individual resilience. So, I absolutely agree with that. The other thing that came out quite strongly for me was the last point, which I think was which takes you to this idea about, belief as well, and passion. And it's really, really interesting for me, in organizations I've worked in, and, having seen a lot of teams, that are high performing, and seeing some teams that aren't. And often there's something quite subtle which seems to make that difference. And I think there is something about, the team really rowing around a purpose, and a belief that they can do something, that they can make a difference, that they can win in inverted commas, that they can achieve something. So I think, instilling that idea about belief in yourself, a bit of self-belief, but then also in individuals, is quite critical. So, I like that from the article. They were probably the two biggest ones that, really, really resonated with me. That,
can I pull you back though? We started the hour with TA transformation, right? Would you mind explaining the context of what is TA transformation? What does it look like? What are its different, most common forms? Just so we can align on when we're talking about TA transformation and change and making mistakes. Just first of all, what the heck do we mean by TA transformation? From what to what? What does it look like? What's your experience? Can you give us some examples?
Go on, Johnny. I mean, do you know what? It's a really, really great question, and it's a tough one to answer in some ways, isn't it? Okay, so for me, the idea about transformation, it's about taking something, whatever it may be. I'll just start with transformation to begin with. It's taking something and then making it radically different. So it's not about continual improvement. It's not about little steps and what have you. It's about transformation. It's almost like metamorphosis. It's starting as something and coming out as something else. So if I take that into the context of some of the stuff I've done around TA transformation, a lot of it has been around operating model. So you've had I've worked in an organisation that had a model where HR generalists kind of did some of the recruitment along with agencies and what have you, and then taking that to being an in-house model. And I remember just a quick story when I won't tell you the name of the organisation, but you can figure out it's one or two probably here. When I remember going around and doing my early bit of discovery and saying, okay, how do you manage recruitment, talent acquisition, resourcing in this organisation? And the person said to me, said, okay, in our team, the people that are involved in recruitment tend to be newcomers, interns, or it's where HR people go when they get a bit tired, so where they can have a rest, if you will. I quickly found out, that that's not actually the best place to be. Talent acquisition is not somewhere for a rest, and I don't think it's it can be a good place to start your career, but I don't think it's somewhere where actually you just want a bunch of interns and what have you. It's a really important function. So I think TA transformation is about the operating model. I think it's also about the positioning of TA within an organisation. So again, if I take that example there, where TA was viewed as something that was a wee bit junior, a wee bit kind of buried, if you will, and then it's about raising it up in an organisation. And actually, I think partly it's about demonstrating to the organisation the art of the possible, because I think there's a lot of expectations sometimes in organisations over the years about what the recruitment team, what the TA team does. Oh, they're here, I think they post jobs, and I think they then follow a process. They execute a process, basically. I think that's what they do. And I think there's a lot of education to be done for organisation about what TA teams can do, and what's the art of the possible. And actually, I think the other bit of transformation is about taking the TA teams from being order takers and doing as you're told, and a hiring manager at the most basic level, a hiring manager coming to you with a list of requirements, and you just go, okay, I'll see what I can find. You post it, and no one applies, or wrong people apply, and then you go, okay, I've done that. Through to this idea about really influencing and partnering. So now, clearly, this is probably nothing new to the audience, but I think what I've learned as well, coming in as a 7-8 years ago, as a novice to TA, I think what I've learned is actually TA often see the world from the TA geek way, if you will, so they know exactly what they can do. And in TA, sometimes we can't believe how stupid the rest of the organisation is. But I think partly what I've learned is the idea about don't underestimate. It's not obvious to the organisation just the things that TA can do, and just the wealth of data and information we have on the market. How useful that can be to the organisation, and by the way, far over and above just for the purpose of recruitment, it can be so interesting to the organisation for things like M&A too. So I think that's something else I've learned, and I think it's around this idea about what is transformation. It's really taking TA from being something that's viewed as a transactional thing, and almost sat next to payroll. And God, forgive me, I do love payroll. They make things right for me every month, so I do love them. But I think it's often in organisations historically, it's been viewed as something we have to do. It's a low-level activity, and it kind of sits in that box. And really, actually, just bringing that up in terms of transformation to being something, dare I say, strategic. So I think that's part of it for transformation for me as well.
We've used a sports analogy already with the Michael Jordan quote. We've a user, I love this quote, who's come in on LinkedIn saying every elite sports professional is the product of their past failures. Actually, in sport, I think that's exactly it. In fact, when you look at the concept of deliberate practice is actually not practicing what you're good at. It's deliberately practicing what you're bad at and trying to, with intention and direction, fix the things that are actually broken. And you got to really uncover those mistakes and things you're doing wrong in your game. If you've got to really, I don't know, I'm not a sports person, right? But the thing you're good at's really good. Let's say your right foot's great. I remember hearing about, you hear about Beckham, you hear about Tiger Woods, and you hear about Serena Williams, and you hear about all these kind of elite athletes. And when the story always goes, when they were younger, their parents or whoever worked with them worked on the stuff that they weren't good at. And that's what made them the elite star that they are. They put deliberate practice and effort into that, call it the mistakes are their weaknesses. And that's what made them whole. I think it's a really good quote from that user who's come in there. And that makes me think about mistakes, right? And brings me back to, the culture of making mistakes. I have a good friend of mine. I haven't talked to him in too long. John Stanners, a shout out to you to say hello. We must catch up. John was a TA leader who went to work for the innovation arm of Telefonica, based out of Barcelona, I think, a few years ago. And he was telling me that was a kind of their moonshot business, coming up with brilliant ideas. And he ran TA for them. And he said the leaders in there were bonused not by their successes, but the amount of attempts they made, failure or success. It was like if Paul tries 4 things and they all work out, Johnny tries 20 and only 2 of them work out. My bonus is bigger than you because I tried harder. And I always thought it was fascinating, this kind of culture of we encourage you to try things. We'll never ever find the next big thing or really solve great problems unless we're okay to experiment and aligned with that. What do you think? What are some of the mistakes you have, the best mistakes you've made? And by best, I mean big mistakes that actually have given you the most insight and learning that have really helped you along your way.
Oh, where do I begin, Johnny? Where do I begin? I've made so many over the years. I'm trying to think of what the biggest one that I made. I'll reel a couple off. Okay, I think in the early days in TA, when I first moved into TA, one of the biggest mistakes I made was, I think, not listening to the right people around me. I would say. I think. I looked to people I thought were experts, and they gave me a view of what TA should be, and it wasn't bad at all. But I think the mistake that I made was I was maybe a bit myopic because I'd come from a different function, a different world. All of these people who I first met in TA, and they're all really, really good people, really smart people. But I think their view was a little bit myopic, and I forgot what I knew. I forgot actually that one of the things I thought I had as a strength was the ability to be broad, and I'd stopped doing that, and I went straight into panic mode and went, okay, I need to know more about subject matter expert. I need to know, subject matter expertise. I need to know more and more and more about that stuff, and I was forgetting some of the skills that I had. So I think the mistake may be about going too deep in things. If you're new to them to begin with, I think that's a mistake I've made. I also remember a mistake quite recently around communications, and I think it was in an organisation where I waited for someone else to do a communication, and I waited because I think I was kind of following what I thought was the etiquette of the organisation. I thought, okay, I should wait. I should not communicate. I should let someone else do that. And it was about a change in policy, to recruitment, and I waited for someone else to do this. And in the end, the message didn't come out in the right way. So, I think one of the other things, mistake I've made is sometimes letting others communicate a difficult message when I should have done that myself. So I think I'll probably go for that, particularly if it's organisationally wide. I'd say letting others communicate the difficult messages because you think, I'm not sure how it's going to land. I think that's probably a mistake. And, I think about, having a bit more courage to kind of do that. I think another one, Johnny, I've made is also sometimes is actually I said listening to the wrong people is also stopping listening to people as well. So again, particularly, I remember a number of years ago, one part of the business was screaming about something they felt was wrong. And again, I thought, okay, what do they know? I'm not going to listen to those guys. And then, I think, it became a really, really big problem. Had I listened to something earlier, I probably prevented something. I think maybe just fourth one, I'll share is also with the idea about sometimes, knowing them when not to let go of something as well, when something becomes like a passion project, if you will, and it becomes very, very personal. So I think, I got really, really quite personally attached to an idea about what should be in our employer brand a number of years ago, really, really quite close to that. And I ended up almost alienating, a lot of the organization, including the VP of comms, over this, something really small. I think it's about a font or something, but I was so in the moment. And, so I think, I almost let go this beautiful alignment that we created for something small, So I think it's also about, sometimes making those mistakes about, almost being a bit bloody minded about perfection. And actually, it's probably, I think it's probably a lot better to have alignment and have things, make compromise on some things and get that broad alignment rather than look for perfection, because you might find yourself with something perfect, but with only you that's there with it.
Your employer brand comment there, I'm gonna let that be a segue back to Josh Taylor's question from a few minutes ago. So Josh asked, when it comes to defining and implementing an employer branding strategy, what have been the best mistakes you've made, and what advice would you provide to recruiters trying to improve their organization's employer brand on social whilst doing their day-to-day recruiting tasks?
Can you read me that one again, Johnny? What in that one? Read that one again.
All right. So employer branding strategy. Basically, what's your advice, right? So what mistakes you made, what you're learning, and you're trying to, maybe this is, down to the structure of how this person's approaching it, as they're trying to do their day-to-day and they're trying to improve their employer brand on social. Is that maybe the fundamental problem, or what's your advice around this?
Got you. That's Josh. Thank you, Josh. That's a good question as well. All right. So my advice, and again, sometimes I think it's a little bit to say, if someone asks you to cut down a tree, spend, and you've got an hour to do it, spend 40 minutes sharpening that axe before you unswing it, I would say. So I would spend a lot of time with employer brand going for alignment. And, the experience I had when I first got some broad alignment on employer brand, and I found actually, everyone in your organization is an expert on employer brand, by the way. Everyone can tell you exactly what it should be. So I think part of the challenge is trying to, get that alignment. So going around asking people, what their views are, what they think is important, what's authentic. So I think spending that time doing that. Then I think it's then about the idea about testing lots of concepts with people. So I saw Simon talked about design thinking earlier. Big fan of design thinking and big fan of prototyping. It's part, the whole test and learn thing as well. So with employer brand as well, I think once you've gone around and done all your stakeholder bit and spoke to a lot of the right people, and clearly the stakeholders in comms, clearly you've got your HR stakeholders, all your business stakeholders. There's a bunch of people to talk to. Don't forget the candidates, by the way. I think that's quite important. And then I think that's part of the next steps. You've got a prototype. You've got to share some ideas and get some reactions to it, because sometimes as well it seems very, very conceptual until you show something how it articulates. So that, I think, for me is another good tip is, begin to get some prototypes out there early. And sometimes I remember what I did. So with a version of the brand that we did, there was a lot of noise around colors in the brand, a lot of noise around colors. What's the right color to go for? What's the palette? And what we did, actually, we did a whole, we listened to that feedback, because actually at the end of the day, okay, I wasn't too precious about, the colors. So I thought, okay, fair enough. But, I had a preference. But I think just actually going through that loop of actually saying to people, okay, lots of different visuals. What does this mean? Lots of different also, we did lots of mock-ups. We did also lots of articulation in terms of how it might follow through to job descriptions, etc., how it might follow through to job ads, all that stuff. And, that constant kind of iterative process of going through the organization and showing them all these examples, that seemed to work quite well, I think, there.
One of the mistakes that I've seen, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm mad, Paul, right? Is that one of the mistakes people kind of make around TA transformation is they underestimate how long it takes. What's
Right.
been your experience on, to get, again, the way you articulate transformation, I think is bang on right. It's not incremental. It's not small changes. Like, it's a big shift in the way we're going to do things. How long does that transformation like that take? What does it look like?
Okay. All right. Good point. There is always a lot of pressure to get things done real quick. And, I remember again, I'm sure my current boss won't forgive me, will forgive me, actually, maybe he won't. Again, that was a mistake. I think he will forgive me, because I remember when we began to talk about transformation, at my interview, and the question I remember he asked me, he said, like, so how long will this will take? Will it take 6 months or will it take a year? And I said, it's probably a 5-year journey that we're on here. And particularly, I think if you're looking as part of transformation, if you're looking at some of the things around, we really want to improve our D&I, which a lot of organizations do. And certainly we're on that journey. Things like that don't happen overnight. So that big shift isn't going to happen overnight, but it's important, I think. Mistakes I've made sometimes around this is sometimes agreeing to too quick timescales. I agreed to a target for D&I recruiting that was way too ambitious before. And then again, and I think it's almost, if you accept these targets in haste, you can, repent about them at leisure. And, so I think the mistakes I've made there is sometimes accepting, a target that's, way too ambitious because I wanted to please a bit, and then I had to live with the consequences of that. But, I think, what I've learned is actually, it's okay to be bold. It's okay to push that timeline out a bit and say, look, for all the things we want to do, we need to do it well. And it's partly about cultural change here as well. So, that is going to take time. And I think what you have to do, though, is begin to, just articulate what some of the milestones might be. Because where people can get a bit lost is if, you say, yeah, it's going to be a 5-year journey and, just imagine, Valhalla over there when we get there, what it's going to be like, and everything's great. We've got the TA teams really embedded in with the business and no decisions are made without talking to us about things. But you've got to be able to show some progress, because sometimes lots going on in the background. And if you can't show some things, then I think you can get yourself in a bit of difficulty. So again, other mistakes I've made is actually sometimes it's that strange mix about, you don't want to be, it's about when to toot your horn, if you will, when to blow your trumpet. So you want to make sure that you're taking people along with the journey and you're giving them that information. And some stuff I think you just can't say enough to people. So I think this idea also about managing timescales at the macro level as to what transformation will take. But even that also goes right down to your team member level. When someone comes along looking for the purple unicorn, again, it's okay for our team members to say, that's going to take a little bit of time here. And, okay, or if you shift this a bit and shift that a bit, that's how I can do it quicker. But I think managing those expectations is so critical. And, it's something that I think I messed up. I was too keen to please. And I sometimes underestimated the as is in the organization, so committed things too quickly. In my current job, I've really, from, the early days, I've set out this idea of 5 years. In my last job, we set out a 5-year plan, but that was kind of after I've been doing it for 2 or 3 years. And we said, all right, actually, well, here's where we really want to go in 5 years' time. And actually, that becomes something quite nice then. It becomes almost your the thing you can anchor things to, and becomes a little bit sometimes the reason to say, well, you're not going to do something. Because, hey, look, this is what we said the plan is, and this is where we want to get to. So these 3 things you're asking us to do now really doesn't fit in there. So we might need to go back and have a look. And yeah, I'm all for agility and flexibility. But, for us to reach Valhalla in the times we said, we need to stick with this.
Yeah, I think your point around, we started the conversation with strategy and which is long-term thinking, right? And the long-term plan. And a good friend recently kind of gave me a great analogy I'm going to use here. I think it's good analogy anyway, which is, she's talking about like, the big plan is we're going to climb Everest, right? But you got to explain how we're going to get to base camp on each subsequent step. And that has to be clearly mapped out with deadlines, expectations. Just saying we're going to Everest is like, well, that's a huge, big thing. 5 years, well, a lot could change. Well, you gotta kind of signal those milestones along the way, what are we going to do look like in 6 months, in 12 months, in 24 months? It's going to be this, and that's part of the journey of getting to where we will get in 5 years. I think it's really, really, really important. And you mentioned as your second learning the power of communication and making sure that you're communicating it correctly. I think that's a big part of transformation, is the communication piece. And whilst you want to empower other people, I think your point is, when it's really important, you got to own it and do it right yourself. You can have a great plan, great team, great strategy, but then it's poorly communicated.
And I think that almost goes to this idea. I mean, I used to love that show Mythbusters. I think it was on Channel 4, wherever it was. I used to love that show. And I think, one big myth that we have, is that people are really resistant to change. And I don't believe that. That's not it. And, the best example of that I always show is I've got something on my finger there that was, it's a wedding ring, that was a big change for me. And I didn't resist that. I have to say I went along quite willingly with that change. So it's not change per se that people resist. I think it's the idea of, loss. I think that's the thing that people tend to resist. And, I think we need to really think about that when it comes to positioning change. It's about, real, frank, open, honest communication. And if there is loss, I think we've got to say it and get it out there. But it's not change that people resist, and we've got to get that out of our minds.
I argue on that thing in your finger, you had trust, you had compassion, you had belief, and you had a really strong leader to get you there. I'm not talking about you, Paul.
Absolutely, you're right, and a very important stakeholder to manage. Which
oh yeah,
that's where I made a lot.
Let's not talk about your partner from the perspective of stakeholder management. I think she'd kill you. So I'm kind of keen to. We're getting towards the end, and what comes next. I'm going to have to lean on you for your tip for the shortlist. But before we do that, maybe what are the kind of common themes just around this TA transformation piece from the mistakes? What would you say are the kind of the key learnings coming from those that kind of big Bible of mistakes? If somebody listening in here is heading into a transformation project, they've been tasked with that, or they're involved with that, what are your top learnings for those individuals? What are you kind of saying? Hey, I've made the mistakes. Here's what I'd say to you to do or don't do.
Okay, right. So here's the first thing. Again, I think manage expectations. I mentioned that earlier. Manage expectations around time and deliverables, I say, is the first thing. I think alignment is more important than perfection, I would say, is the other thing, because that's how you're going to get things moving. And then sometimes you can adjust a little bit to get near your perfection on the way. I think also, do something as well. So, around that transformation, you need to lay out the plan, manage the expectations, and then you need to show, I think, something within the first 90 days, and something that people can really feel, and, I think a good one that I've learned along there is a little bit around how you align the team, I think. So making sure that there are some nice interfaces where people know where to face off to, real simple thing, but actually someone just feels appreciated, okay, being listened to. I think the other thing to think around, in transformation is this idea about experience, and just how important experience is at all levels there. So, so around this idea, really make sure that you're focusing on the experience and you're delivering to the candidates, to the hiring managers, to the organization, and to the TA teams themselves. And, in our transformation now, we're starting with, what is it, in terms of the experience we want for the TA teams? Because, maybe a no-brainer, but how do you expect them to deliver a great experience to the other people if they're having a shitty experience with shitty tools and and no empowerment? How do you expect them to then really deliver a world-class experience elsewhere? So,
I love that trifecta. People talk about hiring manager experience, they talk about candidate experience. They don't talk enough about recruiter experience. I think ideally you have that trifecta. That gives you a really good hiring process. Jane King's just chimed in. I think it's a good quote. Communication plan needs to be aligned to remind people about the end goal, but also achievement against agreed milestones, and to maintain engagement at all levels through the transformation. Back to that communication piece. It's really bang on, Jane. Bang on. Paul, would you believe we're at time? We could keep talking, but I need to hit you with your tips. So as we always do on the show at the end of every week, Paul, I hope you're prepped. We ask our guests to give us a piece of advice that either has been given to them in their career that they want to reshare, or that they would like to share from their own experiences with our audience. So Paul, over to you for your tip to add to our shortlist.
All right, Johnny. Okay, this was one again. I wish I could claim the credit for all of it, but I can't. But maybe that's another tip. Don't be afraid to reuse other people's great ideas. Often cite them if you can, but don't be afraid to do that. But I think really I'd say, look, reflection is really, really important. And you got to be really good at reflecting. But I think as well, never let that move on to recrimination and also to regrets. And the bit of advice I was given that I want to pass on is that forgive yourself. Don't spend too much time on regrets. Don't keep going over regrets, because you probably made the best decision that you could at that time and with the information that you had. So reflect, learn to reflect well, but don't let that turn into recrimination on regrets, because you're probably good enough and you made the best decision that you probably could have done at that time with the information you had. And have that and let that build your confidence. And again, just that idea, I think that word enough is really important. You're probably good enough to do what you need to do. And you can also, I think the other thing is, most things that you try, you can always unwind most things as well. You can pick things, unwind and change things a bit. So don't be afraid to start things, because you can change most things.
I think it's brilliant. So reflect without recrimination and regret, I think, is really important. I think that's what people do too often. They think reflection is about trying to find blame, for example, and it's trying to kind of beat yourself up, and therefore they avoid it because it's not nice, as opposed to going, it's a learning experience. I'm going to reflect on this, think about what went wrong, and move on. Have that, take the Michael Jordan approach of move on to the next thing, have that energy, have that purpose as well. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate your wisdom, your stories. We'd love to have you on again. And thanks for joining us on the show this week. That's Paul Bowles, not Bowles, as we've learned today. That's my mistake for this show. But we're going to be back next week, our first show of December. I'm looking forward to next week. Our guest joining us is our good friend at SocialTalent, Jose Cadlick. Jose is the founder of Good Call and Recruiter Academy, based out of the Czech Republic. And earlier this year, Jose published a free book. I highly recommend you check it out, on COVID-proof tech and tools to make you more successful, particularly talking about how do you broadcast, how do you do meetings online, how do you do events, how do you podcast. A fantastic guide. I'm going to pick his brain on the learning and the research and the story behind how that free book came about. So Jose is going to join us next week and give us all those tips. So if you're keen to know more about how do I do broadcasts, webinars, organize better team meetings, strategy meetings, Zoom, Teams meeting, which tech to use? Should I buy a new microphone? Should I not? All those different tools and tech questions you might have. Trust me, Jose's found the answer, published it, and he's going to be here next week to take your questions and to give you that advice. That's going to be our first show of December, Wednesday, 2nd December, 4 p.m. UK, Ireland time. That's, I believe, 11 a.m. on the East Coast of the United States and 8 a.m. on the West Coast. And of course, you can find this broadcast and all of our broadcasts available as a podcast on Apple and also Spotify. And you can find us recordings on my LinkedIn profile and our YouTube channel at SocialTalent on YouTube. But for all of our broadcasts and a link to the shows, go find us at socialtalent.com/the shortlist. So we'll close out, and I wish our American audience a happy Thanksgiving tomorrow or today. If you're listening to this on your Thanksgiving, we hope you thank our audience members so far who've been asking great questions, and our guests who've had great tips to share. We'll be back next week with a great special on COVID-proofing your tech, and also more news on our great guest to close out December. Until then, take care and happy Thanksgiving.